we may also have a few of our Quebec partners on. I know that Pierre said he was going to be away, so he wasn't going to be able to join us today. I think our recent Vermont CAC meetings, we haven't had welcome and introductions. We're going to make time for that today. Since we've got some new faces and folks involved, I think I'd like to start by having Vermont CAC members introduce themselves, and then we'll move to the New York CAC, and last but not least, any Quebec CAC members who might be joining us, and then we'll move to public comments. If it's taking a long time, we might put off our action item number 3. Both of those items could be taken care of at the next individual New York or Vermont CAC meetings. That way, we'll have time for the rest of the introduction, or excuse me, the rest of the presentations today, and be able to move along. So,
Hi, Mark.
Yeah.
Carol, you are sharing your screen accidentally. Would you be able to stop sharing?
Yeah, I'm sorry. A thing popped up and asked me a question. I thought, I don't want this at all. So,
so how you stop sharing your screen is you would hit the little X button next to the leave button.
An X button next to a leave button.
Yes.
In the upper right-hand corner, the red leave button on the left of it.
To the left of my hang up button is a show participants button. Can't you just shut me off?
That'd be nice.
I have. Maybe I'll leave the meeting and come back.
There we go. Eric requested
Okay.
control. Okay, we're all set now.
All right, thanks.
We're still learning.
The power I get as the director of the Basin program.
Thank you, Eric. So
You're welcome.
I'll start with introductions, and then let's move through the Vermont CAC. I'm Mark Nod. I am the chair of the Vermont CAC. I'm an attorney, and I live in South Hero, Vermont. Hillary, you're top left in my box. You want to go next?
Great. So I'm Hillary Solomon. I'm the district manager for the Poultney Meadowy Natural Resources Conservation District. Our office is in Poultney, and our district covers the South Lake watershed, the Vermont portion, and I live in Middletown Springs.
Jeff, you're next on my screen.
Nice to the
Jeff Wenberg.
Hi, I'm Jeff Wenberg. I've worn multiple hats over many years. I live in Rutland. Among those hats, former commissioner of Vermont DEC, and recently retired from commissioner of public works for the city of Rutland.
Thanks, Jeff. Bob Fisher, you're next on my screen.
Yeah, hi. I'm the water quality superintendent for the city of South Burlington. I am also the new WEA, New England Water Environment Association vice president. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Lori.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Fisher. I'm a Vermont Citizens Advisory Committee member living in Williston, Vermont, and I'm also executive director of the Lake Champlain Committee.
Eric.
Yes, hello. I'm Eric Clifford. I have a dairy farm in Starksboro. It's an 8th generation dairy farm. Kind of proud of that, and very excited having been on the CAC committee for a number of years.
Carol.
Hi, I'm Carol Odie. I was appointed by the Speaker of the Vermont House to serve on this committee as one of the state reps, and I served for 4 years on the House Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Committee. I'm now on House Ways and Means.
Thanks, Carol. Denise, are you there?
I am. Sorry, I'm not showing my face, but I'm Denise Smith, and I'm I work in public health in St. Albans, in the northern part of Lake Champlain. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Denise. Let's see who's next along here. Did I miss anybody from the Vermont CAC? I think I've got everyone. Vic, you want to take it from here for New York CAC?
If you insist, Mark. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the joint, the first inaugural, perhaps, joint Vermont, New York. Well, I don't know. I know Pierre can't make it, but perhaps we can have another guest from Quebec Citizens Advisory Committee. So welcome again to everyone. My name is Vic Putman, Chair of the New York Citizens Advisory Committee, member of Boquet River Association, Trout Unlimited. And that's enough, I guess. Don't need more of my bio. I cannot read the initials of our other members. Fred, I can see, is laughing. So that's as close as I can get, and Jim is here. So if everyone can just chime in one at a time if you dare. So thank you.
Okay, I'll jump in quick. Vic, it's Hannah Neely. I work for Essex County Office of Community Resources as the project coordinator for Essex County, as well as serving on the Water Quality Coordinating Committee.
I'm Fred Woodward, longtime member of the New York CAC, retired college administrator and a lifelong resident of the lake.
Jim, you're up.
I'm Jim Dawson. I live in Plattsburgh, New York. I'm a former retired professor from SUNY Plattsburgh and a former member of the management conference.
Charlotte?
I'm Charlotte Stotts. I am a conservation associate with the Adirondack Council, which is the Adirondack Park's largest environmental advocacy organization, and a lifelong resident of the Champlain Basin watershed.
Ricky?
Ricky was having problems with his audio. Not sure.
Okay, I'm Ricky Lauren. I grew up on a small farm on the lake. I have a camp on the lake on the northern end. So I kind of keep watch and bring information to Vic as we get it.
And Tom?
I'm Tom Metz of Plattsburgh area. Been here 40 years, working on water quality and lake.
I think that's everyone who's on from the New York CAC.
Okay, that does give us a quorum. Thank you all.
Great, thank you. I see that Senator Brock, one of our members, has joined. Senator Brock, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Randy Brock. I'm a member of the Vermont State Senate. I represent part of northwestern Vermont in the Senate, and I'm also the Senate Minority Leader.
Thanks, Randy. Why don't we look? I see a few OBVBM guests. Do you want to introduce yourselves? I see Eric and Francis. Who else?
I can perhaps start, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Andre.
So my name is Andre Barvic. I'm Vice President of OBBM, and I was asked by Pierre Leduc, who you mentioned twice already before, to join this meeting because he couldn't. So, so as I mentioned, I'm Vice President of this organization, and I'm acting there as a president of the Watershed Protection Organization of the front watershed of the Missisquoi River. I am here at the side of the north of the basin of Champlain Lake. And so I will try to answer your question if any. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Eric. I'm an hydrologist at the OBVBM in Quebec.
Great.
Thank you. And Francis?
Oh, you're on mute. Francis, if you go to the top right of your screen, you should be able to click the microphone to unmute.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Okay. Alors, bonsoir. My name is Francis Mayou. I live in Venise, en Québec. I'm a member of l'OBVVM and a member of Conservation B Missisquoi. Voilà.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Do we have any other Quebec CAC OBVBM members?
I think that's it.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. I think now perhaps we could introduce Basin Program members and then move into our presentations. What time? Yes, I think we're still on track.
We also have 3 members of the public on board, Tom Berry, Kent Henderson, and Cree Linthalak. If you want to introduce yourselves in that order.
Tom Berry with Senator Leahy's office. I track Lake Champlain issues.
Thanks, Tom. Kent, are you with us? All right, Cree.
Cree Linthalak, live in Shelburne, Vermont, executive director of Linthalak Foundation that funds projects in water quality, energy, and conservation. Thank you.
Great. And thank you, Lori, for saying we have Karina Daly as well.
Good evening. I'm Karina Daly. I'm a prospective Vermont CAC member, and I work for Vermont Natural Resources Council. I'm a restoration ecologist and chair the Vermont Dam Task Force. Thanks for inviting me to attend tonight.
Hi, Karina. Thank you. Eric, you want to start and we'll go through the Basin Program staff and then get started with our presentations?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. It's great to have members from all 3 groups together. This is something we've been talking about doing for quite a while now, and I'm glad we're able to do it, even if it is virtually. Maybe next year we can actually do it in person. Anyway, I'm Eric Howe. I'm the director of the Lake Champlain Basin Program and the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Colleen Hickey.
Go ahead, Colleen.
Oops, sorry, Katie
No
Starks. I'm Colleen Hickey. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Basin Program.
Katie Dar, Citizen Advisory Committee Coordinator. Lauren, do you want to go next?
Yes, hi, Lauren Jeunesse, Environmental Analyst. I work in the Education and Outreach and Technical teams, and I'm often behind the scenes helping Katie during the CAC meetings.
Good evening, everyone. Meg Modley with the Lake Champlain Basin Program. I'm on the technical team. I focus on healthy ecosystems and aquatic invasive species management.
Sarah?
Hi, good evening. Sarah Coleman, Vermont Coordinator to Lake Champlain Basin Program from Vermont DEC.
Okay, did we miss anybody?
Hi, everyone. This is Erin Venny-Vollrath. I'm the New York State DEC coordinator out of Saranac Lake. And here's one of our younger members, James.
Cynthia Norman. I'm an information officer working in the resource room run by the Basin Program here, located in Echo on the waterfront.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Laura Hollowell. I also work in education and outreach with the Lake Champlain Basin Program, primarily in our resource room at Echo.
Hi, it's Elizabeth Lee. I work on the education and outreach team, primarily communications and publications.
Okay, did we miss anybody?
Myra, did you want to introduce yourself?
My camera's not working. Good evening. I'm Myra Lawyer. I work in the Raybrook DEC office, working as the agronomist for the Lake Champlain Basin Program here in New York.
Thank you. Now we can move to any public comment opportunities. Tom, you want to go ahead? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll go real quick, try to keep you on your agenda. I just wanted to note, as many of you may have heard, that the bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed by the House on Friday, is on the president's desk, maybe signed already. I haven't tracked the news today. Significant as far as Lake Champlain goes, that legislation includes 40 million additional dollars through the EPA for the Lake Champlain program over the next 5 years, evenly distributed at $8 million a year. That is in addition to annual appropriations, which are to be determined for FY22, but we're at $15 million in FY21. So a very substantial increase in funding for Lake Champlain work in that bill. And there are also very substantial increases in the EPA's revolving funds for clean water and for drinking water, with 11.7 billion with a B dollars for each of those programs over the next 5 years, 49% of which must go out in 100% forgiveness loans, or otherwise known as grants, to municipalities. So those are just the sort of two top items in the bill that would be reflected in clean water work in the basin. There's more there as well, but I wanted to flag those two at this time.
Tom, thank you. You always bring good news when it comes to our congressional efforts and Senator Leahy's efforts for Lake Champlain. Any other public comments or questions for Tom before we move on from Tom's? Any questions for Tom?
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other public comment? Okay. Then I think we'll forego our meeting summary action items and just move on to our presentations. First tonight, we've got Dr. Alyssa White. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Vermont in the Gund Institute. And we've invited her to present on her work in soil health and climate resilience, and also to share some of her insights in the agroecology work that she's been involved in for a number of years. So, Dr. White, you can go from here, and I think that Katie will help you with any share screen or any presentations.
Great, thanks for the introduction. Hi, everybody. It's an honor to join you tonight. I'm gonna click share screen for a minute. I have a slideshow that I presented, and it is that I prepared, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't talk and try to click buttons at the same time. But not knowing what the mix of expertise or background is in this group, I tried to make it a bit introductory and also get into some of the research that I'm working on right now. How is the perspective for you? Can you see a nice full screen there?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Okay. And so I just had a little bit of communication in advance, and I didn't put a lot of my research in here, but I have some of it. And I wanted to just check in and see, given that you kind of have a new larger group today, how much time do you want me to take? Because there are pieces where maybe I could go a little bit faster or slow down. And if you give me a sense ahead of time, I can just plan accordingly.
Dr. White, we've allocated about 45 minutes for you, I think.
Yeah.
And so we appreciate, since these meetings, there's a broad diversity of expertise, and also many public participants who might not share in that, but also have participated in our meetings often. So I think if you just move along at your pace and then leave time for more in-depth questions, that would be fine. But about 45 minutes or so is what we've allocated to start.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
That's what I planned on, but I just wondered if maybe I should shorten it. So that's great. And feel free to just, if I'm going on too long, you can give me a heads up. I probably could talk forever. So again, as was introduced, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the University of Vermont. I'm a fellow at the Gund Institute for Environment, and I work really closely with UVM Extension. I have a PhD in plant and soil science from the University of Vermont, and I finished a little over a year ago and did my doctoral research with Joshua Faulkner and Ernesto Mendez, and looked at the influence of alternative soil nutrient management strategies on ecosystem services in the state of Vermont. So that's some relevant background. I don't have all the results of that research here, but I'm happy to share that with you at some point. So I am now in this role of advancing research and outreach and collaboration around soil health and ecosystem services, and really the promise for agriculture to be part of the solution to some of the really pressing ecological crises that are impacting the Northeast right now. And so I feel really lucky to be in this position, and I'm excited to talk with you today. So I'm just going to get into some basics to start. Given the presentation being kind of around soil health and water quality, it's important to define what we mean by soil health, because people get excited about it, but it is really kind of a complex and broad topic. So it's often defined as kind of 3 different characteristics of soil: the physical characteristics of soil, which includes kind of the structure, as well as like the way that water moves through the soil, and then the chemical characteristics, as well as really the biological attributes. And it is that biology, the living part of the soil, that is kind of the foundation for soil health, and really is what it is. And people often talk about organic matter, but that is made up of so many different things, both from the living dead and recently living, from little fungi and bacteria to arthropods and nematodes, and even to kind of the sticky exudates that come off of fungal hyphae. And so when we think about what's going on in the soil, it's not simple. There's a lot to it, but it's this biological activity that changes the soil structure and the chemistry and the nutrient availability of the soil. So the NRCS defines soil health as this continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And I really like their definition. There are so many out there, but it's nice to kind of stick to one that's broadly used across the country. So the NRCS offers these 4 principles for enhancing soil health. And the first here is just maximizing continuous living roots. So, having perennial plants, of course, is the best, but crops in rotation as well. And then minimizing disturbance. So either totally eliminating tillage or reducing tillage can have a really beneficial impact on the biology and the benefits of soil health. And then we also know that biodiversity, both in the plant and invertebrate populations in the agro-ecosystem can have many different beneficial outcomes. So, maximizing biodiversity is going to increase the different types of organic matter that are in the soil. And then the other principle really here is to maximize soil cover. So that's both from reducing or eliminating tillage, but also to mulching. And that really, especially when we think about water, that's really important because it slows down the flow of water across the landscape, allows more time for infiltration, and really protects the soil from the impacts of erosion and evaporation from the sun. So there are many benefits and outcomes that are attributed to healthy soils. These four, I think, are a really nice way to kind of phrase the four that are most common and really in the high level policy and public conversation right now. So it's the capacity of healthy soils to increase water infiltration and storage and allow for greater resiliency in times of drought or in times of excess precipitation events, as well as the capacity for soils to regulate nutrients and other kind of chemicals. And then, of course, carbon storage and carbon capture is top of mind. I'm sure I don't have to explain to you the value and the excitement around that right now. But by increasing the amount of organic matter and really the living portion of the soil, we can increase the amount of carbon in there and offset the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And then this one here about biological function and diversity, I think that one is really exciting because we know there's lots of downstream kind of broader ecosystem resilience attributes that are associated with increased biological diversity. And then, of course, the capacity for an agro-ecosystem or soil to support production of both crops, but also in forest and riparian zones, vegetative health. So I think when I was getting ready for this presentation, I was thinking about a conversation I often have with farmers is about how they believe that by enhancing soil health, they get all of the outcomes that are good. And there is this often a conception that by enhancing soil health, you always get water quality benefits. And that is not totally true. And so I don't know kind of the level of knowledge of the folks in this meeting tonight, but they are related, but they're not always correlated. And so there are really important kind of static factors or things that you can't change about a site, the geologic characteristics, the soil texture, as well as kind of the vegetative landscape characteristics that are really important mediators of the nutrient and chemical pathways that we're interested in understanding and influence kind of water quality outcomes. And so those are things that are not always able to be changed by enhancements in soil health and often can drive the water quality outcomes. And so I like to think about this as we have landscape characteristics and soil health together that influence water quality when we're thinking about kind of managing agro-ecosystems. And we have some really great tools that exist, like the Vermont P-Index, the Russell tool, even the NRCS curve number approach captures some of the connections between the static landscape characteristics and management that together influence water quality outcomes. So the soil health is really that living piece, as I mentioned. It's dynamic and it's driven by the biological activity. And we know that management can influence soil characteristics that can have an impact on water quality, but it's not the entire picture. And so I think that's really important as we, as you think about investing in soil health as part of the long-term planning for the Lake Champlain Basin. It's not. I think it's really important and it has value, but I don't think it's a silver bullet, and it's not. I don't think we should toss out some of the other tools that we're already using. But I think there are really great, important kind of co-benefits that we can get from investing in soil health. So I'll try to get a little bit more to that. But different ways that we can manage the landscape influence some soil characteristics, and those are called the dynamic soil characteristics. So that includes things like organic matter content and biological diversity. It's the physical kind of stability and the aggregation of the soil structure, and that also influences kind of the amount of air and water movement that can flow through soil, and we can measure that as things like bulk density or infiltration. And those pieces that are dynamic have really important influences on lots of different ecosystem services. So in my work, I like to connect measuring characteristics of soil health to ecosystem service supply. And I think these are the ones that are kind of most important to the conversation in Vermont policy right now in some of my work. So that's carbon storage and climate regulation, as well as nutrient cycling, and climate resilience is really important, as well as this increased interest in how soil health and investing in changes in soil structure can reduce downstream flood surges. So let's see. Okay, so I just in case, we needed to get into it, these are the tools that I think are really great for predicting water quality and soil conservation outcomes. And I just mentioned them, but you'll notice, in the P index, that's really to assess kind of the risk of phosphorus loss from agricultural soils in Vermont. And that includes both, characteristics of the site, the location in Vermont, its elevation, how far away it is from the waterway, but then also some of these dynamic pieces. So the crop type, surface cover at time of planting, manure and fertilizer application management. So those two are combined, and then this over here on the right is the Russell tool, which is used to kind of predict erodibility or soil loss. And that also includes some of the site characteristics and more of the management too. So the two together. And so I think, these are the practices that we're talking about or inferring to there, that the management practices that enhance water quality also have soil health benefits. Lots of them do great soil building. And so that's, crop rotation that I'm sure you're all familiar with, as well as cover cropping and the reduction of tillage. That includes, mulching, mulch tillage, efficiently managing nutrients, and integrating pest management to reduce the use of chemicals. So just to put a little illustration behind that, we recently looked at some data from Ben & Jerry's Caring Dairy program. And so their Caring Dairy program is a way that they incentivize environmental outcomes from their dairy farmers. And they give them a premium or a payment incentive to adopt conservation practices. And one of them is cover cropping, but they hadn't really verified that. So just a couple months ago, we looked at their big data set, and they had measured soil health outcomes using this Cornell assessment of soil health, which is pretty kind of a standard nationally used assessment of soil health. And we found that in the fields where cover crops were used, there were significant differences in organic matter content, available water capacity, biological indicators like active carbon and respiration rates. And so, the evidence is there in our region that that conservation practices that build organic matter and build soil have these soil health outcomes. But I think there's a bit more research that's needed. So I think this is kind of where we're at, and where we need to do a little bit more work is to quantify the potential other benefits of water quality best management practices. So how do they enhance soil health? What are the nuanced kind of ways that we can get to increasing some of these soil health outcomes that are associated with climate mitigation and climate resilience? So I guess I wanted to just kind of make a really clear connection here between the biological activity and the soil organic matter, the life of the soil that we've been talking about, and the ways that we can measure it, measure its influence on soil characteristics, and what that means for kind of the ecosystem services or the socially relevant outcomes. So soil aggregation is essentially like the extent to which the soil sticks together. So when we have lots of different types of roots and fungi and bacteria. They exude all these kind of sticky carbohydrate-rich substances that act like glue and pull the mineral soil particles together and create kind of more like a crumb. If you can imagine a beautiful loaf of sourdough bread versus like a plate full of flour, they're made of the same basic ingredients, but when you add the biology and the process, you get a sponge that will absorb soil and allow air through rather than kind of a pile of flour that would clearly just, the water would like roll off the side there. So the soil aggregation, that's something that we can measure, and it's an indicator of reduced erosion. So soil that has good aggregation loses less soil in the face of a heavy rainstorm or something like that. And then water holding capacity is somewhat similar. It's the organic matter acting kind of like a sponge, and that confers drought resilience to the agroecosystem, be that, you know, annual crop fields or a hay field or even an orchard or edge of field kind of grassed waterway or riparian zone. We measure organic carbon as an indicator of carbon storage and soil carbon sequestration. And then we're really trying to narrow in on how we can best measure infiltration and porosity, because those are kind of the soil characteristics that come from biological activity and life in the soil that can help increase infiltration during precipitation events and reduce the downstream flood risk. So we already know that farmers are using soil health to address extreme precipitation risks. I helped do a survey, must be 4 or 5 years ago now, where we asked farmers what strategies they were using to limit their risk from extreme precipitation events, both heavy rain and drought, and the majority of them said that they use soil health to address those risks. So we know that there are lots of co-benefits to enhancements in soil health, and so that you know, that's a good thing. But where I'm at right now, I think we don't know, you know, we really need to verify those outcomes for the practices in our region and the ones that are being adopted through all the really great work that the water quality community is doing in supporting farmers to adopt best management practices. And so we know, you know, we have some data that supports things like, you know, using cover crops, enhancing organic matter. But when you look at the research on that at the national and international scale, it's not always consistent. I think there's a promise that practices can have soil building and carbon sequestration benefits, but it's not always the case. We're lucky in the Northeast, we have a climate and soil texture that are really of a high affinity for sequestering more carbon. But we do need to do a bit more research to verify that that's what's going on in our region. And I think that's a great opportunity to match the water quality goals, at least in the state of Vermont, with the climate mitigation goals that we're pursuing right now in the Global Warming Solutions Act related climate action plan. Let's see. So, you know, I think there's also a really important research need right now to identify potential trade-offs. Some of the research that I did for my dissertation work, we found that there were potential trade-offs in soil health and climate mitigation outcomes. And that is primarily because we often don't account for the unseen pathways. And so we may see that there are changes in recommendations around practices that influence climate mitigation. So I think the two key pieces that we really need to dig deeper down on, one are understanding the subsurface nutrient flux. So that's water that is moving nutrients and chemicals off of a field and into the watershed, not off the surface, which is where most of the research that's behind the recommendations for best management practices is really based on understanding surface flows and nutrients flux. But often the subsurface pathways can have the majority of the nutrients or chemicals. And it's just really hard and expensive to measure that, and it just hasn't been done enough. And so I'm really interested in doing more of that and looking at some of the emerging and exciting practices and kind of quantifying that subsurface piece. And the other is the greenhouse gas emissions from the soil surface. So in one of the projects that I looked at in my dissertation, we measured carbon sequestration over 6 years in these alternative management strategies. And we also measured greenhouse gas emissions. And we found that even though there was a net gain in soil carbon, if you also included a measurement of the nitrous oxide emissions and equivalated them, that the practice was a net source of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's just also a place that there's not as much research as there should be, and we kind of need to verify those pieces, especially for the practices that we're encouraging farmers to adopt. And of course, you know, we all need to better understand pesticides and how to limit their use. Okay, what's next here? Sorry for going on so long. Yeah, so you know, the soil organic matter, that is the living part of the soil that I'm talking about. It is really only a tiny part of the soil. It's generally max maybe 6% of soil mass, and it's made of a bunch of different types of organic matter. There's the decomposing part, which is considered the active carbon part, and that's often kind of the most responsive piece we can measure due to management. There's living organisms. There's this piece that's referred to as humus, which is actually now outdated. I don't think people call it that anymore, but there is kind of like this stable and kind of faster cycling parts of the organic matter. And so in some of our research, we're kind of looking at how different practices influence both the faster cycling and the more stable parts of the organic matter portions. See, I think we talked about a lot of this. This is just a lot of the outcomes that we attribute to increases in organic matter. And this is really the foundation of what we associate with soil health and what we can measure about it. But there are other aspects to it too. Yeah, and so increases in organic matter, even just small percentages, 1 to 3%, can reduce erosion 20 to 33%. And so when we think about co-benefits, you know, not just focusing on phosphorus loss, but that reduced erosion in general can be really valuable co-benefit of investing in soil health. This is a really nice picture to just kind of illustrate what I'm talking about in terms of soil structure and aggregation. And so on the left there, we have this really nice crumb that allows infiltration and movement in the soil. And on the right, you know, if you don't have cover, then you get surface sealing, and it reduces the capacity of the soil to even just allow water in at the beginning of a rainstorm. And so the importance of soil cover and organic matter and really structure, I think, is just nicely visualized here. And then, you know, I'm sure you've heard people talk about organic matter and how it's kind of like a sponge. It really is. And even when you feel it, it's much like a sponge. It has the ability to absorb 90% of its weight in water, which is huge. And it is really often considered kind of drought insurance for farms. And it is influenced by soil texture. So sandy soils tend to have less organic matter than silty, and certainly clay soils kind of have the greatest affinity for organic matter. Let's see. Okay, so I think that was my whirlwind tour of what I wanted to talk about in terms of soil health and water quality. And I'm excited to talk to you a little bit more about which pieces, you know, your conversations have been going towards and where you're looking at in your programs. But I was asked to also talk about agroecology. So this is, I studied with Ernesto Mendez, who's an agroecologist at the University of Vermont, and he works locally, but he also works in Central America. And agroecological approach is something that's not isolated just to being used in academia, but is really considered as a scientific discipline. But also there is a movement that is behind agroecology. There's some really strong rural and small farmer networks around the world that use agroecology to pursue both kind of a balance of environmental outcomes and rural development. But it's and then as a practice, we also consider it kind of the implementation of certain techniques. And so agroecology is a really great big umbrella to capture lots of different approaches. And I think it's a nice connection for folks that want to merge both scientific approaches and understandings of agroecosystems with transition and change in agriculture, and really also connecting it to the social social viability and social justice conversations. Agroecology is primarily guided by sets of principles, and I've got one up here that's from the FAO, which is a nice one, but it also is guided. There are a couple different transformation frameworks that are used in agroecology to study how to meet farms where they're at and support them in transitioning to more sustainable agriculture and sustainable food systems. So I include this one here, the 5 levels of agroecological transformation from Steve Gleesman, because I really like it in that all farmers can kind of see where they're at and identify kind of the next step to take when we're designing programs or research. And so I think it connects well with kind of contextual uniqueness. So I like that. And then in terms of these principles, so this is a nice set of principles, but there are certainly many different sets, and I think they get revisited and revised, but they really apply to any context. So diversity is a core one, and that in agroecological systems includes crop diversification, the maintenance of local genetic diversity, incorporating animals, soil organic matter management, water conservation, and even livelihood diversification, because all of that reduces vulnerability to climate variability. And that's key to addressing climate change. Synergies as a principle, that's agroecological practices that aim to enhance positive ecological interaction, synergy, integration, and complementarity among the elements of agroecosystems. So that's plants and animals, trees, soil and water, and that give opportunities to build synergies and kind of manage trade-offs across the multiple objectives of food security and climate change adaptation and mitigation. So the goal is really to find, is to reduce trade-offs and find synergy. I think it might take too long for me to kind of work through all of these, but I think one of my favorites here is the co-creation and sharing of knowledge, which really sees local and ancestral knowledge as the foundation for the actual and future agricultural innovations and technologies to deal with climate change, given in particular the ability of traditional farming systems already. We just observed that they recover from recent and past climate challenges well, and new knowledge is necessary, but it's really the agroecology places particular attention on incorporating the contributions of both scientists and farmers. So I think that's important. Yes. So yeah, and that is something that's really foundational to my own approach, is just using the integration of both farmer voices and the academic and scientific approach to identify the places where support is needed and how to get to kind of change and resilience. And it requires a very different approach to kind of traditional research. It places farmers and stakeholders at the very center of defining the research questions that we need to answer and how to develop solutions that are workable and will enable change. So let's see. What I wanted to share with you, because I think it's kind of relevant to this conversation about soil health, is some preliminary survey results. So kind of related to this goal of integrating farmers' perspectives, we often do focus groups or surveys to ask farmers questions that relate to some of the biophysical science that we're doing. And so, you know, in my role here as a fellow at the Gund Institute, supporting research and collaboration around soil health, we did this survey last year and asked farmers about kind of what enhances their ability to support soil health on Vermont farms. And it wasn't just farmers that took the survey, it was also technical service providers and really anybody that had some stake in soil health in Vermont. And so by identifying these factors that enhance the investment in soil health, it allows us to kind of match kind of bigger programs with the biophysical research that we're doing. So of course, financial incentives, you know, farmers always talk about how they would love to do more and invest more in conservation, but they're really limited by farm viability and just the capacity to financially invest in changes. And of course, farmer networks have been identified as incredibly important in enabling farmers to learn about new practices that and learn about how other farmers are achieving greater gains in soil health and the benefits that they're seeing from that. And of course, you know, community support and collaboration, the social capital and relationships across different stakeholder groups was named as really important. So this is kind of preliminary results, but I just wanted to show you that this is the kind of thing we like to match with the other research that we're doing. We also asked them about what's limiting their capacity to support soil health on Vermont farms. You know, financial concerns came up again, but time is a really, it's a very real and a salient concern for farmers. A lot of folks, not just farmers, but others, really want to see more connection between science to practices, and specifically in our region, right? So having kind of local data that they trust that reflects the climate and the management regimes that are here in our area. Yeah, there was some policy concerns as well as just the potential lack of connection among different stakeholders. Okay, so that's just, we can talk more about that if you want to, but I do want to just, I think I've got a couple more minutes, and I wanted to tell you about one project that I'm working on that I'm very excited about, and I just want you to know kind of what we're up to. So we have started this project called the State of Soil Health, and the goal is really to establish a baseline understanding of soil health indicators, many of those that I've mentioned today, but also really focus on carbon stocks and soil health indicators that are associated with ecosystem services in Vermont's agricultural landscapes. So in February of last year, we kind of reached out to all the different groups that we knew that were interested in soil health or measuring soil health on farms in Vermont. And we got everybody together, asked them to measure the same things so that we could kind of offer a statewide comparison. And so we created standards for soil sampling across all the different partners. And then we kind of created this space to support collaboration among all these different organizations that are already working with farmers towards these shared goals around soil health. And that includes lots of different folks. So we have some researchers from Dartmouth College. We have a number of conservation district staff that have been involved in this in different ways. We have the Vermont Environmental Stewardship Program is doing data sharing. There are a bunch of different University of Vermont extension projects that are sharing data. Ben & Jerry's is part of this. The Nature Conservancy pitched in and gave us a little bit of extra funds to extend our sampling and reach some of the regions of the state where there weren't existing projects. And so it kind of, you know, it's a convenient sample because we're looking at existing projects, but we were able to kind of extend our reach and offer kind of some baseline insights into where we're at in terms of soil health in the state. And one of our other goals was to give this information back to farmers because we've heard from them that they want information about soil health that is very specific to their own farm. And they talk about how if they had more information and they understood better the differences among their fields, that they would use that information to make more informed decisions. And so while we haven't been able to give farmers like tons of soil health tests, we've often been able to give most farms at least 2 to kind of compare and give them a locally specific range of soil health. And the other thing we're doing is we've been training a lot of people in how to measure soil health and using these shared standards and just building the knowledge base and the capacity for doing soil carbon and soil health assessments in the state that hopefully will inform other projects. So we're kind of here in phase 2. So phase 1, we looked at existing data that had already been collected in previous years to kind of give us a range of soil health, but there weren't soil carbon stock assessments with that. And then over the 2021 season, we did this coordination and have been to about 200 fields across the state of Vermont, which is really exciting. And we're hoping to kind of use that as a foundation to build more robust sampling that can give us some insights with greater scientific certainty, to include greater participation and be more responsive to the requests and interests of farmers and others, and add some additional measurements around pesticide use and other things like that. So we're in a kind of an exciting phase, and we hope to have more information to share with you in the future. Let's see. Oh, I've got a nice little map. So this is, it's not completely up to date. We have a few other out around, but we certainly have a lot of sampling, you know, with the farms that Heather Darby has been working with, and we do have quite a few in Addison County that may not all be on this map. From the Conservation Effects Assessment Project that Joshua Faulkner is coordinating. So we have a good number of fields to, you know, to in the next coming months really share out what the current state of soil health or the expected ranges are on farms in the state of Vermont. And we are asking farmers to share some management information so we can associate some of the outcomes with higher levels of soil health and look for kind of where the most important places for improvement are needed. And then of course to look at how some of these static factors like soil texture influence all of the outcomes that we're interested in. Okay, so this is a slide that's showing you kind of what methods we've been using. So we've been looking at soil carbon stocks. You have to measure both organic matter content, but also bulk density to get kind of the quantity of carbon that's in a certain depth of soil. So we've been measuring bulk density and organic matter to 30 centimeters because that's the international standard. And that was kind of an important addition because most soil, although we have required a lot of soil testing on farms in the state of Vermont, it's only to 15 centimeter depth or so. And to be able to kind of compare to the international conversations around soil carbon stocks and sequestration, we have to measure a little deeper. So we bought a bunch of bulk density equipment, have been out there, and we're also in this shallower portion of the soil. We've added a couple kind of exciting new measurements that weren't as widely done. So our collaborators at Dartmouth are measuring the different kind of short and long-term carbon fractions, and we're doing a carbon substrate assay. And so essentially, we put the soil into solution and then we put it into some wells in triplicate that have 31 different carbon substrates, and then they change color depending on how much they're consumed, and we can see kind of the diversity of who's in the soil, and so we get a diversity index number, which is kind of exciting, and what kind of carbon is being consumed. So we're getting a little bit more perspective into the biological diversity piece. Yeah, and here's kind of the exhausted list of all the indicators on the left, what we're measuring, and then on the right here are the kind of the outcomes and the kind of what those indicators mean. So this soil health cache piece is the Cornell Assessment of Soil Health test, and that the Cornell Assessment of Soil Health is a suite of soil health metrics that were developed over a number of years at Cornell that include both biological, chemical, and physical characteristics of soil. And so we've been using that, which gives us a lot of really interesting information, and then adding the soil carbon stocks, the biological functional diversity, and carbon fractions, as I mentioned. And so that allows us to kind of understand where we're at in terms of some of these ecosystem services and nutrient availability as well. So in terms of maybe some preliminary data, we have found some surprising results. Okay, so based on this early data, we see that hayfields have some of the highest agricultural soil carbon stocks, which maybe isn't that surprising because they have really low disturbance, right? So they're not losing a lot of organic matter to respiration from being disturbed. I think we still have a few more fields to get all of the data back for, and so I'd be curious to see if pasture fields maybe have a broader range. Vegetable fields are kind of on the lower end, I think, because they just rely on so much kind of disturbance. And what is so fascinating is I think some folks assumed that cornfields would have low soil health and soil carbon stocks, but there's really a huge range. And so to me, that makes me wonder, what is going on the cornfields that have really high soil carbon stocks? And what are the leverage points in management that are influencing kind of that variability within the range? And so when we do some analysis with the management data this winter, we'll be able to kind of dig a little bit into that, and that's exciting. We were able to compare some of the data we've collected with other information we could find to kind of see if we have a representative sample or not, or comparable. And so our data, we collected this last year, when we got to 145, we looked at the average organic matter, and it's 4.4, which actually really lines up with a number of the other data sets that we could find. In fact, it was a little bit lower than some of the other ones. So some folks were concerned that we were just getting data from like the best fields in Vermont, but it looks like we actually have a decent sample to say some things with. And it's also nice to see that when you compare it nationally, Vermont has higher organic matter content than the national average. That's not surprising because we have clay soils that have a high affinity for carbon, and we don't have a dry climate, and we're not losing stuff to drought. So, okay. I think this is just a really similar, this is the similar data, but just kind of showing you the distribution there. And so what's different about this figure is you can visualize it, but also that you see that there really are a lot of high outliers. So there are fields and samples that have been submitted to a number of these different projects that have really high organic matter, up to 20%. I think knowing that the median and mean organic matter content in our soils is over 4%, some folks wonder if maybe we don't have as many gains to make. But I think when we look at this, we can see that it's clearly possible to achieve maybe, 6-7% organic matter. And so that's kind of setting our sights as a goal. All right. Well, I think with that, I want to thank you so much, and just maybe open it up for conversation. I think I'm really, not having been to your meetings before, I'm really curious about where your conversations were at before I came, and what you're most interested in pursuing, and what I should have included in my presentation that maybe I didn't. So I will, let's see if I can stop sharing. Now I can see your faces again. I hope that wasn't too boring. I really appreciate you inviting me to come on a Monday evening.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. That was a really engaging presentation. If folks have questions, either use the raise hand function or turn your camera on and raise your hand, unmute, you know the drill. Francis?
Yes, Dr. White, that was a most interesting presentation. One question, can we go and see it somewhere, your presentation?
Sure, yeah. I sent a copy to Katie right before the meeting, and
Yes.
she can send it out. Yeah, be happy to share.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Lori?
Thanks, Alyssa. I really appreciate the presentation. I'm wondering, you mentioned the survey that you did to farmers, and I apologize if I missed it. What was the kind of demographics for that? What were the focus? What types of farmers? How many? Could you give us a little more background on the survey and when you did it?
Sure. So I guess I mentioned two surveys. One, I mentioned just the evidence that farmers are investing in soil health for climate adaptation. And that was a survey that we conducted in 2018. And that was, I think, 194 farmers from across the Northeast participated in that survey. That was primarily kind of targeted towards vegetable and berry producers, though we did have some other kind of diversified farms and others, but that was kind of targeted towards them. And then the other survey that I mentioned was we had asked farmers about kind of what limits and enables them to invest in soil health. And it wasn't just farmers that we surveyed, although I think I maybe prefaced that because that's the part that I was interested in. But it was a multi-stakeholder survey, and it was part of, UVM has started this new ARS center, Agricultural Research Center, on food systems, and I was part of the soil health kind of group, and we put a white paper out based on kind of potentially what the ARS Center should measure about soil health, and did this stakeholder engagement process. And so those were questions that we added to that survey to inform that process. And I am looking for, I can look for the demographics for that, but I will say that I know that the folks that responded to that survey in particular tended to be more like stewards, right? Folks that were getting out there and interested in responding to emails about soil health. So I unfortunately don't have how many farmers it was right in front of me, but I think we had maybe, was it 145 responses, and I would imagine maybe a quarter of them were farmers, but I can follow up if you want the full results. We haven't published it anywhere, but there is a graduate student that is hoping to do that.
Thanks.
Mark?
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Alyssa. I think the presentation was fantastic. A lot of interesting information. I think the CAC, we've been have had presentations regarding the payment for ecosystem services and techniques and practices on farm fields, particularly cover crops. We heard, and I'd like you to maybe dig in a little deeper on your slide regarding the unseen pathways and trade-offs. But we heard regarding cover crops, the mechanical techniques for releasing the spring crops weren't as effective as I think many people understood, and that it was requiring an increase in the use of glyphosate and atrazine for herbicides to provide that release. And so the increased utilization of pesticides seemed like a net negative potential trade-off perhaps, or unseen path. So I wonder if you could explore a little bit more for me. I didn't really understand the subsurface nutrient flux. And then also, I think you followed up and said that while there was a net gain of carbon sequestration at the surface level, there were some additional nitrous oxide emissions. Could you just dig into that a little bit more for us? Maybe what are some of the trade-offs or unseen pathways that we're starting to understand? I know that there seems to be a lot of energy towards payment for ecosystem services and soil health, and the Vermont CAC's primary role is to deliver an annual report to the legislature and provide an action plan for recommendations. And so some of our concerns about pesticides and perhaps new policy, new research, new considerations as we're moving down this path really focused on soil health. Some additional information would be helpful, I think, for all of us.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I've got these slides from a different presentation that share some of the unseen pathways that I didn't include in the one for you today, because it takes a little bit to talk through the whole study that we did. But I think this is a nice one to talk about the unseen pathways. So there was a couple things there. So like one, your question was kind of what are the unseen pathways and what are the concerns and trade-offs that I alluded to? And then, can we talk a little bit more about pesticide use and how it's associated with cover cropping and no-till and what the potential trade-offs there are? And then kind of maybe what the implications are for your work and what you recommend. I think clearly, like any research into pesticide alternatives, so roller crimping instead of herbicide use to kill down cover crops makes a lot of sense to me. I think that that's a huge research need, and I know that there are some folks that are interested in that. And I would say it would be really, I'm excited for the focus not to just be on herbicides, though I think that's really important, but also to include some of the other pesticides used. So we have a new researcher we just hired here at UVM who her expertise is doing integrated pest management with animals to reduce the use of anthelmintics and kind of anti-parasite treatments for animals. And so what happens when animals are given a lot of anti-parasite medication is that it kills it's retained in the manure, and that it influences the soil invertebrates as manure in the field. And the soil invertebrates are the ones that kind of the beetles that dig down and really are super important to creating infiltration pathways in the soil structure. And so we likely see a reduction in infiltration and other things when we have that. So sorry to go on a tangent, but I'm really excited to learn from her. And so I think, recommending more research on pesticides seems like, or the strategies that farmers can use to reduce pesticide use, because there are some options out there and we just maybe need to understand them better, and also to work with farmers to figure out how to make it work on farms. So the use of herbicides in no-till and in cover crop systems you may get gains in soil health because you're getting more organic matter retained in the system. But because folks don't measure herbicide in runoff as often, we really don't understand the trade-off very well. So I can't make a recommendation for what farmers should do, but that I would love to understand it more. And we know that there could potentially be kind of other things we do. Okay, so I guess I answered that backwards. That's my thoughts about pesticides. And then in terms of unseen pathways, okay, so let's see. Here is I had these two paired watershed study design that I worked on with Joshua Faulkner, who you've probably met and maybe has come and presented to you. And essentially, we looked at two different management practices. Here on the right, we have the 2 cornfields, each of which are kind of their own mini watershed. So they drain to this little red point is where we're catching all of the surface runoff from the field, this field. And then this other red point is where we're catching all of the surface runoff from the other fields. And then the yellow point is where we're measuring subsurface nutrient pathways. So we can understand the nutrient flux in the surface water runoff as well as the subsurface water runoff. And so that's important because, you know, phosphorus and nitrogen and other waterborne chemicals and nutrients don't just end up in the watershed based on surface runoff. But that's the easiest part to measure because we can see it. And it's the easiest part for us to build our management around because we can see the influence on surface runoff water quality. But a lot of nutrients end up in the watershed after they filter through the subsurface soil. They don't just disappear there. There are subsurface pathways that end up in the watershed, and so that's considered subsurface runoff or subsurface leaching. And it's really hard to study because you might be able to measure a single point, but you have to measure lots of points and also kind of look at it at the watershed scale to understand what's actually ending up in the river downstream. So in this study, we measured surface runoff. We also measured indicators of subsurface leaching. So that was these little yellow points here. And because it's only 1 point, we can't say for sure that what we measured is actually ending up in the river, but it does give us a little insight into what's going on. And so essentially we found that the proportion of soluble phosphorus and total phosphorus in the water was much higher in the subsurface water that we measured than it was in the surface runoff. And so it suggests to us that the subsurface pathways could be one of the primary ways that that nutrients and other chemicals are ending up in the downstream watershed, and that we really need to understand them better and ask all of our collaborators and researchers to include some subsurface monitoring. And of course, it's more challenging to install a subsurface lysimeter, but our results suggest that that's a really important pathway. The other thing, let's see, we measured both soil carbon changes over time as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And so we can equate those as metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So we looked at nitrous oxide, which is like 298 times as strong as carbon dioxide. And we also measured carbon dioxide from the soil surface as well as changes in soil carbon. So together we can get kind of an overall balance of impact on greenhouse gas mitigation. And so I will say it wasn't just me. Lindsay Barbieri, who recently graduated as a graduate student from UVM, did specifically the greenhouse gas monitoring, and she has another paper coming out. What I'm talking about right now, we just published a paper, so I can send that as well. I apologize for taking so long to explain this, but here's kind of the big picture with the unseen pathways in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So we also measured the equivalent metric tons of carbon dioxide in the tractor fuel use compared between the treatments, and we found that the tractor fuel use had really negligible impact on the overall kind of climate mitigation outcomes. We see that there was a net soil carbon gain in all of the fields, so that's good and that's exciting. But when we included nitrous oxide emissions here, that's at the top, and carbon dioxide emissions, some of the fields, most of the fields were kind of a net contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. The soil carbon gains didn't offset it for all of them. So I think that, you know, this is just for fields, but the point is that these unseen pathways that are hard to measure and rarely measured can be kind of the dominating influence on the ecosystem services that we care about. So, you know, including greenhouse gas emissions in research along with soil carbon, I think is a really important kind of like emerging need for research. Okay, I'm sorry for going on so long, but I'll turn it back to questions now.
Thanks, Alyssa. Jim, did you have a question? Your hand's up. Oh, you're on mute. Jim, you're muted. Oh, you unmuted and then muted again. Okay, there you go.
Okay. How would forested land compare to what you're doing with your agricultural land?
I think that it's likely that you would need to include the perennial vegetation in the overall influence on climate mitigation, and that those sequestration rates are really high in the beginning as plants are growing, and then as the forest gets really old, it's not you're not getting as big of gain in time. So it really depends on the time scale at which you measure in the forests. And what's really, the bad news is that there's some bad news. It's not really simple. It's not cut and dry. It's really contextually different. And so having research that pertains to what we're doing here at our timescales is really important. But there is research from the Midwest on the subsurface phosphorus pathways. And it looks like often riparian zones are uptaking phosphorus and reducing soluble phosphorus loss for a period of time, but then they become sources as they get older. So like after 20 or 25 years, you may end up with a forest being a source. So I think that I haven't done specific research in forests, but I don't think it's as easy as saying forest good, field bad, and that we clearly need to dig a little bit deeper, especially in our region.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alyssa. So we are a little behind, and I want to make sure Brian gets a chance to give his presentation. So if there are other questions, maybe put them in the chat and we can follow up with Alyssa, if that sounds all right.
Sure, and I'd be happy to respond. If folks want to dig into anything deeper, I'd be happy to respond by email. I'm sorry it's not so simple, especially that last part I shared.
Alyssa, thanks again. It's Mark. Thanks again for a great presentation. I'm sure folks might have more questions, and thanks for the opportunity for follow-up with you directly. And we'll look forward to you sharing your presentation, and I think you mentioned a recent study that was just published that we can share with everyone after the meeting. So thanks again. So now, Brian, thanks for being patient. Brian Steinmuller. Brian's going to update us on the New York State Climate Council. We had hoped to have our state climatologist present, but she's at COP26. So we'll hope to have some follow-up from her and from the development of our climate action plan that's in the process of being written right now. So Brian, thanks again.
Thank you. Katie, are you okay advancing my slides?
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you all so much for having me tonight. And definitely, Dr. White, that was a fascinating, very comprehensive presentation, and really, sets the stage scientifically for the kind of policy recommendations that I'm going to discuss tonight. So again, my name is Brian Steinmuller. I'm the Assistant Director for the Division of Land and Water Resources at the Department of Agriculture and Markets. And I also act as the Assistant Director for the New York State Soil and Water Conservation Committee as well. So wear a couple of different hats. And I'm going to talk to you tonight, if you could, next slide, please. Talk to you tonight a little bit about the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, along with the Agriculture and Forestry Advisory Panel recommendations for our state's scoping plan. And as Dr. White has already talked about, a number of climate mitigation practices dealing with agriculture and forestry have very specific and comprehensive co-benefits, environmental benefits. And I also have a part of this presentation on the New York State Climate Resilient Farming Program. I think for the sake of time tonight, I won't go through those slides specifically, but certainly they will be available, as a part of this meeting record. And if in your review interests this group, I would be glad to come back and talk more about that. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the CLCPA, was passed into law in July of 2019. It sets out to accomplish very ambitious emission reduction targets, and also a number of interim targets as well. So by and large, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act sets out to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. That is an 85% reduction of emissions over 1990 levels, with that remaining 15% really coming up with an equal amount of sequestration capacity in both our forests and farmland and land use in general. It includes a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030, time frame target that is right around the corner, as well as 100% zero carbon electricity by 2040. It also establishes a number of advisory panels, including the Agriculture and Forestry Advisory Panel that I was a part of, and also has climate justice and just transitions as a part of the core overall goals for New York State. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the Agriculture and Forestry Advisory Panel. It was chaired by Commissioner Richard Ball, Commissioner of the New York State Department of Agriculture. It was made up of 18 experts in the field of agriculture and forestry. Certainly a diverse set of expertise that includes farmers, foresters, academic researchers and professors, policy experts, as well as conservation professionals. And the recommendations that were developed by this panel that the Climate Action Council, our New York State CAC, Climate Action Council, is considering for the scoping plan, really was developed comprehensively as we had to break into subgroups to deal with certain aspects, as both agriculture as an emission source, as well as agricultural lands potentially leading to higher sequestration, along with forest lands as well. So we broke into subgroup teams. We had numerous meetings as subgroups and advisory panel meetings to develop a set of recommendations that is currently under consideration by the by the Climate Action Council. Next slide, please. And although the full set of recommendations are very detailed, a couple of key themes became apparent across all the panel recommendations. One, reducing emissions from agricultural operations, primarily nitrous oxide and methane. And two, boosting our carbon sequestration capacity in our forests and on our farms in New York State. Along with these two key themes, other key considerations were discussed throughout the process. Realizing, as we just talked about, some emission and sequestration sources require long-term strategies. For example, it can take decades to realize additional tree cover and years of careful management to build soil carbon. So not always so easy, as Dr. White had talked about, to research these types of land use trends and changes over time that can take decades to accomplish. Also realizing that agricultural emission reduction strategies had to be designed and must be implemented to keep farms viable so that we minimize the potential for farms to move to other states or for those farms to go out of business and experience land use changes that often have a much higher carbon footprint. So emission leakage, as it's called, is really important to avoid. Again, that would potentially raise opposed to lower global greenhouse gas emissions if we were to tackle these issues in a way that does not keep farm viability at the center. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides here really break down the agricultural emission reduction strategies. And these are really broad brushes here. There's a lot of detail behind all of these. But As we heard, nitrous oxide emissions 298 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than that of carbon dioxide. Good news is New York State farms and New York State farmers have been doing tremendous work over the years through nutrient management planning and implementation, so that our nitrous oxide emissions in New York relatively smaller in percentage than other agricultural areas across the country and certainly the globe. But we can still do more. So this strategy really focuses on reducing nitrous oxide emissions through more efficient use of nitrogen fertilizers, while also meeting yield and quality through expanded nutrient management, planning, and implementation on agricultural fields, all fields that receive fertilizers and nutrients from manure. So again, this builds on our solid baseline of nutrient management planning and implementation through our water quality initiatives, and also attempts to develop new incentive structures to bring even more farms into our planning structure, into the implementation of those nutrient management plans. Next slide, please. So this strategy right here deals with agricultural methane emissions. In New York State, our ag emissions are primarily made up of methane, about 90% of our emissions. And methane comes from two different sources on farms, manure management and enteric fermentation. So our strategy here deals with managing manure in a way that reduces methane emissions, meeting farms where they're at, specifically planning systems for particular types of farms, so that we can avoid methane production in the first place, and where we can't, where we've already built manure storages for water quality and nutrient management, we can retrofit those storages, cover those storages, capture the methane, and convert that methane into carbon dioxide. Methane being 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas over a 20-year time horizon. So this strategy really here is all about the way we manage manure on these farms. And we're talking not only about manure storage covers and flares, but also the potential for anaerobic digesters, carefully managed compost systems, and certainly other strategies that can prevent the anaerobic conditions that lead to methane production from our manure storages. Next slide, please. Thank you. The second source of methane emissions on farms is related to enteric fermentation. And here our strategy is reducing methane and also nitrous oxide emission while achieving ruminant growth and lactation goals through precision feed, forage, and herd management. Many farmers in New York are already doing this, certainly in Vermont as well, but more can be done to fully achieve the emission reduction goals. The strategy requires a comprehensive outreach and training to all of our livestock farmers to utilize feed management tools, tools that are available today, tools that we need to develop into the future, as well as an acknowledgement that additional methane emission reductions may be realized through feed additives or feed supplements that are under development and under testing now, but if deemed safe and widespread for long-term use, we can dramatically reduce our emissions from livestock operations. Not just looking at our current tools, but also what is available around the corner. So this is probably one of the harder emission reduction strategies to achieve, and certainly one that requires continual outreach and training, but also continual research and development. Next slide, please. So the second main theme of our panel's recommendations include increasing our carbon sequestration and storage capacity in our forests and on our farms. The panel identified a number of individual strategies to meet these goals. First off, we talked about avoiding conversions of forest and farmland, which is defined as maintaining and enhancing the state's carbon stocks and sequestration potential through the avoided forest and farmland conversions to other more greenhouse gas intense forms of development. So ways of doing that could be establishing a no net loss of forest land goal and law in New York State. We also can invest more into our farmland protection programs in New York, that provides conservation easement funding to our farms so that they can remain as viable operations into the future. We also talked about forest carbon mitigation, so establishing a mitigation framework for the conversion of forest land to development. Next slide, please. So this strategy here relates to increasing carbon sequestration and storage while reducing net greenhouse gas emissions through soil health management practices. And not just implementing those practices, but the word adoption here is underlined, adopting these practices in the long term. Dr. White talked extensively about how soil health practices can meet so many environmental objectives, but there's still so much research that can be done and challenges to verify and quantify soil health as a carbon mitigation strategy. But realizing that the types of soil health practices that we could implement here for increasing our sequestration capacity also meets so many other water quality and ecological goals. We certainly recognize where soil health practice adoption can be a part of the solution in New York State. Next slide, please. So we're still talking about agroecological principles, agroecological concepts here. We talked a lot about agroforestry as a panel, and agroforestry is a strategy that deals with deliberately adding trees to areas of agricultural production, such as silvopasturing, alley cropping, and even riparian forest buffers, certainly practice systems that meet our water quality goals. And although the panel has broader reforestation and afforestation efforts, the panel felt that integrating trees into active agricultural areas or at the edge of fields and riparian areas takes a different approach and consideration. Very careful management, significant amount of technical assistance to our farms. So like soil health, agroforestry practices have many other co-benefits, which include income diversification, increased farm viability, air and water quality benefits, among many others. Next slide, please. Forest management. We broke up into a subgroup to talk about forest management and really identified as one of the most important strategies for maintaining and increasing carbon sequestration is through the improved and sustainable forest management planning and practice implementation. So this strategy will help to secure forest regeneration, improve forest health, and restore degraded forests. Also, as Dr. White said, it's complicated, right? So as forests mature in age, they sequester less carbon. So how can we manage those forests so we can continue to have regeneration, continue to have mixed age forests so that we can maximize the amount of sequestration per acre of forest land in New York? To accompany this strategy, the panel discussed and recommends the development of innovative incentives for forest and farm landowners to continue improvements of land for enhancing sequestration and storage. One way to achieve this, as our strategies indicate, is a potential forest carbon market, such as the Family Forest Carbon Program created by the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy. This would be where progressive companies could help to meet our climate goals by supporting sustainable forest practices that sequester carbon. So in addition to the traditional incentive structures for forest management through programs like Regenerate New York, our panel also considered and looking very closely at those new and innovative incentive structures. Next slide, please. So in addition to forest management, reforestation and afforestation efforts in New York, very important to meet our sequestration, carbon sequestration climate goals. Very simply put, this is about planting trees wherever appropriate, focusing on underutilized lands, and increasing tree seedling establishment in existing forest lands that are understocked. Next slide, please. Actually, before going into urban forestry, just also want to, going back to reforestation, afforestation efforts, the panel identified, and there are some scientific research that has been recently published that identify the use of underutilized agricultural lands, marginal lands that could be good candidates for reforestation efforts. Along that research has indicated about 1 million to 1.7 million acres of agricultural lands, underutilized or marginal lands that could be candidate for reforestation. So in addition to looking at forest regeneration, we're also trying to identify areas that could benefit from reforestation efforts. Okay, so urban forestry. Also realizing the distinct consideration and benefits of urban trees. These components relate to increasing tree canopy cover in our urban and suburban areas through tree planting efforts on both public and private lands. As with many of the panel strategies, urban forestry efforts have numerous associated benefits, including reducing heat island effects, improvements in air quality, and increasing carbon sequestration, of course. Urban tree planting efforts have with it unique and sometimes challenging maintenance issues and needs. This strategy includes consideration of improved maintenance of urban forests and trees to increase longevity, canopy cover by helping to facilitate the growth and maintenance of older and more mature trees. Next slide, please. Our panel broke into another subgroup focused on the bioeconomy. This is really interesting and potentially transformational issues here and needs. The climate-focused bioeconomy, this strategy refers to the advancing the portion of the economy that produces sustainable, renewable bio-based feedstocks rather than fossil fuel-derived feedstocks that produce products that achieve both the climate and social justice goals of the CLCPA, including job creation. So the bioeconomy subgroup of the advisory panel focused on building a long-term bioeconomy supply chain in New York State that can serve to meet present and future market needs. These recommendations from the group are based upon finding opportunities to substitute bio-based products for fossil fuel-based products, such as increasing the use of wood in construction, using biofeedstocks to create solvents and polymers, as well as a strategic approach to bio-based fuels that would be needed for hard to electrify portions of our economy. As already mentioned, this is also a way that we can create markets for sustainably produced feedstocks, which has the added benefit of job creation in some of our disadvantaged communities throughout New York State. Next slide, please. So in addition to the strategies that identify emission reduction and sequestration capacity as a part of the CLCPA, we're also required to look at how our recommendations will advantage or benefit disadvantaged communities. So our panel really looked at our strategies, not just under the lens of reducing emissions and increasing sequestration capacity, but also how we really are striving to increase research and planning and technical services, as well as financial assistance to the farming and forestry sectors. This will certainly improve access to programs and effective practices for all farms and forest landowners, but also prioritizing disadvantaged communities by placing emphasis on agricultural and forestry technical assistance funding to historically underserved and disadvantaged community members. We also recognize that our strategies not only reduce emissions, but also improve the resiliency and viability of our farms. And these improvements in food production capacity, resilience, and diversity will also have positive effects on disadvantaged communities. And we also looked at how our strategies benefit rural economically disadvantaged communities, as I mentioned before, under the bioeconomy recommendations. These do include environmental justice areas, and certainly by improving the forest-based economy, we're also increasing job opportunities. These strategies will help lower to middle income landowners to hold on to their forest lands, to maintain open space and keep forests as forests, and also to sustainably manage their lands over time. Next slide, please. And in addition to our benefits to disadvantaged communities, certainly we're also very mindful of health and other co-benefits, as we've been talking extensively tonight about soil health and forestry and forest management. These projects not only reduce emissions, increase sequestration, but also improve air and water quality, biodiversity, can elevate local food production and diversification of farm incomes, which can also lead to increasing farm profitability, so keeping those farms as farms. Numerous studies in the U.S. and around the world are exploring the health benefits of spending time outside in nature. So, looking at forests specifically, maintaining those forests and making sure those forests are viable and getting people out to enjoy and to realize the benefit of those, certainly as connections to human health as well as ecological health. And also worth mentioning again, protecting well-managed forests and farmlands also has the potential to maintain and improve our food production, community resiliency, as we've talked about, water quality, air quality, and certainly storm and flood mitigation. So our practice systems that we're identifying here and recommending for strategies not only will help to increase our sequestration, lower our emissions, but also improve our resiliency of our natural and working lands in New York State. And like I said before, I also included some information on our climate resilient farming program as well. This is a next slide, please. This is a program that we have been implementing since 2015 and certainly has been identified as a vital tool in helping us to meet our Climate Act goals, and certainly will be referenced in the Climate Action Council scoping plan. And I just also want to mention none of the programs, the projects that we've talked about, either on farms or forest land, would be possible without the tremendous assistance from our soil and water districts in New York State. There's 58 conservation districts, which encompass all 62 counties. New York City boroughs form into one district. So districts have been vital in implementing our ag environmental management program, climate resilient farming, as well as our water quality programs, and certainly are looked at as a vital partner to increase capacity to address climate goals into the future. At the end of the presentation here, which again, just for the sake of time tonight, I won't go through the remaining slides, but as my contact information. And when you go over these slides in your own time, and certainly Katie, if you'd like to have me come back and talk about our climate resilient farming program specifically, I'd be happy to do so. But again, thank you so much for your time tonight. And really, it's been a pleasure to talk to you about our state's climate goals.
Thanks so much, Brian. Jeff, you have your hand up.
Yeah, and I'm going to do this real quick because this is actually a kind of a personal aside that I'm taking here. I found your presentation not only interesting, but personally vindicating because back in 2009, 2010, I was working with the Center for Climate Strategies, and I was the project manager for the New York State Climate Action Plan that was developed at that time, principally under, it's still on your website,
it is
principally under Governor Patterson.
That's right.
And to see that you have, and you're talking about one sector, we went through the whole gamut, but to see the degree to which you have picked up and carried forward in a very significant way the work that was done way back then in 2010. We only completed an interim report at that time. There was a change in administration from Patterson, who was actually quite committed to pursuing this, but he was not exactly popular with the voters, let's put it that way. He had issues. And then when Spitzer came in, because of Patterson's issues, just leave it at that, Spitzer didn't want to put his name on really anything that Patterson had essentially ownership of or that he had created, at least not something that was in this field for whatever reason. So I always wondered whether it just sat on a shelf or whether the basics had been adopted and carried forward. And in your field, forests, agriculture, and so forth, it's exactly what you've done, and you've taken it a lot further, and I applaud it. Thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you very much. I did work on that plan back in 2010, and certainly the CLCPA is a very comprehensive very comprehensive law that sets out admission targets and builds off of previous work that has been done. But you're right to point out that even though we don't reference the climate action plan from 2010 all that often, we certainly learned a lot from that process and started to implement those recommendations, specifically as our involvement here with the Agriculture and Forestry Technical Working Group, which you probably remember, and how we carried on the advancement of programs as a result. So thank you.
That's terrific. Thank you.
Jackie?
Sure. Hi, Brian. This was a really great presentation. Just a quick thing. I was wondering if you could clarify the role of young forests and sequestration, the role of older forests and carbon storage. I think it would be good to clarify that. And then my other thing I wanted to ask is, how has the expedited development of more rural lands like the Adirondack Park been part of the consideration of the recommendations that the Agricultural and Forestry panel has decided its recommendations, just because we are seeing such an accelerated level happening here, and thinking about the goals that we need to achieve in terms of sequestration and seeing our forests cut down for development? How has that played, if at all, a role in your deliberations?
Yeah. So my technical and policy background is more on the agricultural side. We did bring in the forestry sector under one panel, so it was a little bit of a learning curve for some of us in agriculture, and certainly Commissioner Richard Ball, his experience both as the commissioner over the last 6 years, but also as production farmer in Schoharie County. We all learned a lot from folks at the Division of Lands and Forests at DEC. So I might not be the best to answer your question, but I can say that those forestry subgroup discussions and recommendations that we've made to the Climate Action Council consider both sequestration, so through forest management, to ensure that we can have a mixed age of forests, so that we can reduce high grading to the extent possible, and have a healthy forest that does include the potential for harvest in the future, but in a way that promotes sequestration, while we might be removing some of the forest stock of that is currently holding that sequestration potential. So, part of what the bioeconomy subgroup recommendations were as well is to not just replace fossil fuel intensive feedstocks such as steel and concrete, but if we are also able to use mass timber design, that wood continues to be sequestered into that building envelope. So ways that we can actually incorporate sustainably harvest, sustainably managed forest feedstocks into our infrastructure was also a consideration of our panel. And as far as the Adirondack piece, I'm not sure if I followed your question. And like I said, I might not be the right person to answer that, but I certainly could point you in the right direction, as we had experience from foresters, as well as the Division of Lands and Forests from DEC assisting in our work.
I could follow up with you another time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Brian. I don't see any more hands up, and being mindful of the time, I think we should probably start wrapping up. That was a great presentation from both you and Dr. White, and I definitely learned a lot, and it sounds like everyone else did too. So I really appreciate you two coming on to the call tonight and sharing that with us. In terms of meeting timing and next steps for future meetings, the Vermont CAC meets next on December 13th. New York CAC, we can connect offline about when we'd like to meet next, because I don't think any of us will want to meet on December 27th, which would be our normal meeting schedule. Some items that are on deck for both the New York and Vermont CACs to discuss, and Quebec as well. include the Basin Program's opportunity for action, the management plan. We're working on updating that for the next cycle. So we'll want to get the CAC's feedback on that, as well as the International Joint Commission's Lake Champlain Richelieu River flood study is coming to a close. And so there's been a request for some targeted stakeholder feedback from the CACs in terms of the social acceptability and political feasibility of the recommended actions coming out of that study. So those will be featured on some upcoming agendas in the near future. Mark, Vic, I'll hand it back over to you. The 13th, Carol, I believe.
Katie, thanks so much for supporting there and for the follow-up. Yes, the Vermont CAC will have a meeting on the 13th, possibly with some follow-up from Vermont's Climate Council, and also work on our action plan. That was part of an agenda, some discussion tonight, and these great presentations used up that time. So Denise and I and Katie will reach out later this week to CAC members on our action plan. Thanks again to all of you for joining. Great to see you all. We look forward to another opportunity, perhaps with the IJC presentation where they've requested some follow-up, or the opportunities for action. We'd love to meet again and maybe have a chance to have some conversation amongst us all. And Vic, I'll pass it on to you, but thanks again to everyone for tonight, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Katie. Thank you to the presenters, Ryan and Elisa. Thank you very much. It's been a very informative meeting, and it's our first joint CAC meetings. That's a great opportunity for the future. I hope we can meet in person, and with that, I guess
you're here.
We'll adjourn. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.